ESG, environmental social governance. What's that all about? Well, on this episode, we're going to get to the truth behind what's really going on here. We're going to talk about where it comes from, where it's going, and how this is all ultimately about control and reshaping markets around the world. Welcome to Cutting Edge Faith. I'm Ryan Howard. This podcast is here to help you understand the times, stand for truth, and grow in your faith. Now, there's a lot to get into when it comes to ESG, and we'll see how much we have time for. But don't worry, there's going to be plenty more episodes coming about this and more about the Corporate Equality Index and DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. We've got lots to unpack here, lots to talk about, and we're going to be talking about the anti-Christian culture that is happening in corporate America. We're going to be talking all about that coming up on Cutting Edge Faith. Now, let's just dive right in. In this episode, I really want to give you a 30,000 foot level of what's really going on here. And the goal is to help you understand with a lens from reality of what's really going on here, because there's lots of virtue signaling these days in the past few years, and it's been accelerating, it seems. And we really need to know what's going on here, because then you'll be able to have eyes to see and ears to hear. And then when God is speaking and the time comes for you to stand, or the time comes for you to not kiss the ring or bow the knee, whatever it might be, you'll be able to, because you'll know what's really going on here. And I like to say here too, at Cutting Edge Faith, we bring you the truth behind the headlines. That's what's really going on here. Now, I've seen some articles lately that have said, oh, ESG is on the way out. DEI is on the way out. Well, it doesn't really seem to be that's the case. It may be coming under a new name or having less focus for now, but it's getting deeper and deeper into corporations. And what's really going on there. And so let's get right into it. What is ESG? Well, I already said it's environmental, social governance, environmental, social, and governance, ESG. And it really is very pervasive. I saw some research that said between 75 and 86% of Fortune 500 companies either have made public statements or public commitments about ESG. They have issued reports with ESG findings and reportings and what they're doing in their company. They have set uh, related executive incentives around ESG, and they have explicit ESG driven initiatives that are underway inside the organizations. And that includes DEI. That is a subcomponent of this, which we'll get into a little bit on this episode, but we'll be diving a lot more into that in future episodes. So what does it refer to? It refers to a set of criteria used to evaluate a company's impact and ethics that go beyond financial performance. So by definition, it violates fiduciary duties. It actually goes outside of what's necessary for shareholders. So a quick overview. Okay, environmental. Let's talk about that. It includes things like tracking the company's carbon footprint. Yes, carbon footprint. Resource management. Now that makes sense. You want to know how the resources are being used. What about reliance on fossil fuels? That's another thing that's being tracked. Pollution being tracked, and sustainability initiatives. Now, sustainability initiatives, I've worked in manufacturing and global supply chain for the last 20 years, and sustainability is nothing new. That's certainly, we should be going after renewable things when we can and having sustainability and those sorts of things where it makes sense. But when we start getting into the climate agenda that is 100% politically driven, well, that's a problem, because now we're talking about getting into direction of an entire industries, these companies doing these things. Like I said, 75, three quarters or more of the Fortune 500 companies, corporations doing this, going down this path. Okay, that's just environmental. So what about social? So that's issues related to human capital, like labor practices. Now that makes sense. We understand that. Okay, we want to know what that companies are not using slave labor or children. That's illegal, and so we want to have good engagement in communities. That's corporate social responsibility. Now those are things that have been around for a while. I did my master's degree back in 2008. And we were talking about all that back then. It was none of this woke stuff. It was just about, hey, being a good steward of the community. That makes sense. Well, when we start getting into other things, well, now we have data privacy. That also makes sense. But diversity and inclusion. Now that's also under social. And there is a whole sub industry that has come up now of these expert consultants that sort of came out of nowhere on diversity and inclusion. And I've seen lots of different trainings on this. I've been through some of them myself. And well, we're going to save that for another episode. We'll get into it a little bit here, but okay, diversity and inclusion. Now, you'll have to know that they are redefining those in a lot of these cases. Now, when you look at diversity by itself and inclusion by itself and equality by itself, those are, or equity, those are good things to have. But when you put them together, well, it starts to become something different. And so that's where a little sleight of hand comes in. And so we'll get more to that on another episode. But okay, what about governance? Well, this makes sense. This is like board accountability, executive pay, business ethics, having transparency, anti-corruption, that sort of thing. Okay. So you see the issues here are okay, carbon footprint. There's a big time worldview that is necessary to adopt in order to execute these things. There's that this inequality out there, and we need to make it equal. We need to make all things equal and even. And when you hear that, you think that's not, yeah, of course. I mean, we should have equal playing field for everybody. Well, that's what's said. But what ends up happening is they end up going after a equal outcome. That's what it's really moving towards. It's changing requirements. It's changing what they're looking for and all that just to get an equal outcome, or at least the perception of an equal outcome. And it's an ever changing thing, and we're always chasing this, and it's always changing. But that's the way it is. And that's the way it's going. And so, traditional corporate governance would just look at the way companies are governed and their purpose. And it would look at having power, how power is distributed. It would have accountability and how decisions are made. That makes sense. That's traditional corporate governance. It's been around since as long as I know, as long as I've known. And so that's important. Okay. But what we have is the rise of what's called stakeholder theory or stakeholder capitalism. So these Fortune 500 companies, they are going away from shareholders to stakeholder capitalism. So shareholder capitalism is where you're just trying to maximize profit for the shareholder, all right? People who have bought parts of the company. And it's going to what's called stakeholder capitalism, which brings in a whole another group that they need to consider. And what the problem is that this gets into saying, okay, the environment and these bigger picture things, these are social and political causes that are being brought now into it's politicizing finance, it's politicizing corporate America. And so that's a problem. Okay. But where did this come from? Well, you'll hear, this really accelerated the DEI and all that sort of stuff really accelerated after George Floyd, who overdosed. I did an episode on that. That was not a murder. You could argue that it contributed to it, but there's a whole nother episode on that. Just a trigger warning. You can check that out. What happened is you hear companies saying, well, our shareholders are asking about this. Our stakeholders are asking about this. And what it really is, it's not you and me going to our person managing retirement funds, or maybe you manage it yourself, and asking about this. It's companies, large investment firms like BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard going and pushing these things and asking for it. And they're doing it through shareholder proposals, basically getting into some of these reforms to consider emissions and climate risk and disclosing all these things and talking about how many people of different ethnicities do you have working there? How much diversity do you have? And trying to hold boards accountable, doing proxy voting and all these things and doing different investor strategies. And so this is really coming from that. It's coming from the big centralized control of these big investment firms. And now, if you just look at how much BlackRock owns, and this is not just, oh, let's be against BlackRock. I mean, that's a part of it. We're going to talk about how the government is involved in this as well. But that's really where it's coming from. When you hear these companies saying, well, our shareholders are wanting this and that and this and that, it's these big companies that's asking for it. Okay. And so another piece of this could be that these companies are trying to virtue signal. And so it's like, well, we just got to do something. Let's add a DEI office and let's track our climate footprint. And that way we can get them off our backs and we can get access to this other funding, because these BlackRocks, if they want access to funding and lending and all these sorts of things, these investment firms, well, they got to meet these certain standards. And so that's where this is coming from. And so that's why you see places like companies like Target doing these crazy things that make absolutely no sense, or Anheuser-Busch with Bud Light doing things that completely alienate their customer base, because, well, they got to do this. They got to take the step so that they can get access to this other funding or these investments or get this better score if they do something publicly and this and that. Some companies are more external and some are more internal only. But that's why you see these crazy things. And then you get people put in place that are subpar, and they're making decisions that don't make sense. And so, but that's what's happened with this industry that has popped up out of nowhere. And that's where That's where you start to get those kinds of things. And so we see these actions taking place, and what is it getting? What are we getting for it? Well, it's causing problems. It's causing problems inside companies. We saw at Harvard, this went up to the Supreme Court, and the president of Harvard recently resigned because of similar things here. And there's other stuff going on there, but DEI has really come under question here now, and all this ESG stuff. And so, but that's really what it's coming towards. So what I was saying is these companies, they try to do these things so that they can virtue signal and get people off their back, or maybe protect themselves legally or whatever. They have these different requirements. But is it really doing anything? Is it really doing anything? Now, I've seen also in some of the proxy votes that I did for some of the companies that I own shares in, there are actually now audits coming to say, hey, is there reverse discrimination taking place because of these policies? Are they actually leading to the opposite of what they purport, what they say they're leading to? And there's actually proposals for some of these companies to actually go in and audit that. Now, whether a conservative organization does that, or a true reality-based organization, or whether it's to come in and just kind of rubber stamp and say, yeah, look, it's great. Who knows? I mean, we will see. But what are these measuring though? I mean, environmental, social, governance. How do they actually measure it? Well, for environmental, greenhouse gas emissions, I mentioned that, carbon footprint, energy usage, efficiency, renewable energy goals, those sorts of things. Social. Now, this gets into workforce diversity and inclusion data. So how do you measure that? Well, these companies will say we have quotas. It's different than a target. It's different than a target. Well, and then they use a bunch of word salad to explain to you the difference between a quota and a target. And so, yeah, the governance things, I don't have so much an issue with governance. There may be some that I'm not aware of, but what I really think is critical is that we understand that this is really about control. And if you don't think it is, let's talk about a similar system that kind of reminds me of ESG, and that is the China social credit system. And believe it or not, they've also got a corporate social credit system. That's right, China has that. Did you know that? Well, let's see. What are they doing? They're monitoring the behavior of of all the citizens, all the people in their country. Well, how do they do that, you say? Well, they've got 700 million surveillance cameras. 700 million surveillance cameras. That means there's one lens for every two citizens. That's a lot of cameras. Did you know that in China, I've done episodes on this too, but if a person jaywalks, they walk across the street, the camera will recognize them, and it will send a signal to the system, and it will automatically remove the fine from their bank account. That's the kind of control that the Chinese government has. And here's something that's even more crazy. Okay. Then they had technology that even when wearing a mask, having their face covered from the eyes only, they could tell just around the eyes who it was. That is right. And now they can even, this was years ago, and now they can tell by how someone walks. If you just have a silhouette of the pacing and how they walk and how they carry themselves, AI and all this stuff can assimilate all that information and can figure out who that person is, exactly who it is, and then go take the money out. So, yeah, that technology is already in the US. All the technology is already here. It's just a matter of flipping the switch. They already have these kinds of profiles on all of us. And so, yeah, let's see some similarities. So it's a unified record keeping system. It's regulating social behavior. They say in China, it's about measuring trustworthiness. So in other words, it's about measuring, are they doing the things that the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, wants them to be doing? State agencies and local authorities manage that. And if they get a bad social credit score, what difference does that make? Well, their kids might not be able to get into a school. They might not be able to get funding for something, might not be able to get a loan, might not be able to get housing, might not be able to get access to different things throughout the society and around the community. All kinds of things, like the homeless populations in China have rapidly increased during and after COVID, because you'd take their phone and they would have to scan and have red or green to get into their own apartment. And then it would scan red because, well, hey, they were in this area that was a high risk for COVID. Well, it turns out could have been anything else. Could have been they went to a church, or they searched online for Bibles, which actually has happened. They've gone back and looked at 3 years of search history and prosecuted people for things that they looked for online. So this is getting into thought crimes, I think, here. So they codifies approved behavior. Okay, that's what ESG is doing, and that's what the Chinese social credit system does. It does surveillance and external monitoring of behavior. It has ratings and scores to quantify behavior. It restricts access and opportunities based on that behavior. It encourages conformity without wavering. There's government influence and oversight. People will say, no, ESG is completely voluntary. It's completely different. We're going to talk about that. There's ambiguous criteria. It's arbitrary enforcement, and it reinforces other propaganda, other things going on in society. So, yeah, some similarities, don't you think? So let's talk about that government involvement. Are they really not involved? Well, let's see here. We've got reporting requirements now from the government. We've got financial incentives from the government. We've got investor advocacy and pressure from political leaders. They're talking about it. There's lots of pressure coming. So let's see. Reporting requirements. The SEC is starting to require more disclosure around climate risks and other ESG factors in financial filings. So, financial filings, the Securities and Exchange Commission, which is about avoiding antitrust and making sure you're doing what you're supposed to be doing financially and tax wise and all that, and regulating different industries in that regard. Now they're requiring reporting on these different factors. There's a little bit of an assumption in there that climate change is something that humans are impacting. Well, that's very debatable. In fact, it's not really debatable. We're not influencing it, but that'll be, again, a topic for another episode. There's executive orders that have issued to push federal agencies to integrate ESG criteria into policies, procurement, so things that they're buying, contracts that they're giving out, regulations impacting different industries as well. There's agency actions. So Department of Labor proposing rules that require ESG considerations to be made by pension funds, investment managers, and retirement plans. So yeah, this is totally getting driven by the government. Absolutely. Now, whether it started with them or not, it doesn't really matter. I think there's actors that it's coming from that is influencing both the big business, the corporate BlackRock and all that, and government. There's a puppeteer above that. There's also government contracts I mentioned. There's international commitments that the U.S. has made for ESG goals. There's incentives like government subsidies, loans, tax credits, and they all factor ESG performance and incentivizing companies to adopt those. So what do we I mean, every new construction, all the stuff by the Biden regime is putting in electrical charging stations in all these new constructions throughout the U.S. And there's incentives to do that. Okay, we can say that's great. That's people got electric cars and we want that and all that. And okay, fine. That by itself, okay, fine, no problem. But also there's legislation being looked at to put remote kill switches in all vehicles and having that be required by law. So that means they can be shut off at any time. By the way, you went over your carbon footprint for this month, so no more driving. Or you drove too far last month, so now you got to drive less this month. Yeah, I mean, you can see where this is going. We got to have our eyes open. So there's other things that they're doing to put pressure as well. But you can see there's some coercion happening here. What about employees? So these companies have employees that work there. So is there impact there? Well, there's job requirements. So could be implementing inclusion programs or going to inclusion training or diversity training or documenting ethical practices. Now, again, a lot of this stuff by itself, I mean, it's innocent enough. I mean, okay, yeah, of course, I like diversity. I learned about diversity during my MBA program. We had people from 10 different countries in one room, and it was very awkward. And, five to seven different industries. And then we all got to know each other a little better. We went out and did like a little physical ropes course thing where you help each other out and teamwork and all that. And the next week, it was like a family. It was completely different. We didn't need 50 hours of diversity training. We just had a shared experience together and got to know each other a little better. And that was incredible. So we've got training mandates coming in. We've got policy changes in these companies. There's monitoring, tracking of diversity statistics. So how many Black people are employed, or how many Black people got interviewed, or how many women, or how many Asians, how many different, whatever ethnicities it might be, and actually having requirements I've heard stories of, hey, they interviewed these 3 white guys or 4 white guys, and they couldn't make the job offer until they interviewed a black person for the job, because then it was inclusive. And the guy couldn't find anybody to interview for 3 months. So that guy that they thought was going to get the job sat there for 3 months waiting so they could interview somebody. And well, then they finally interviewed. Still, the guy was the top guy, so he got the job. So interesting, restricting some opportunities. There's some green workspaces that's happening, green workspaces, so-called, which, restricting disposable cup usage or thermostat settings. Like, these are just insane. There's also stakeholder scrutiny and all that, and reputational incentives. So that could be, employees being compelled to align their personal views and behaviors with that of the corporate ESG goals and measures that they're taking. So you can see there's a lot to unpack here. I kind of just did this flyover, and there's a lot more to go into with each of this. I'm going to be talking more about this. We're going to have some guests coming on soon as well, talk about ESG and DEI. Like I said, there's good individual pieces within a lot of this, but then there's a lot of garbage. There's a lot of wasted just efforts, and there's a lot of money, and it's crazy, and it's all about control. And so I hope this helped give you a little bit more understanding of what's really going on here, and I hope that you will share this with a friend. Now, if you're watching the video, make sure you like and subscribe and comment below and let me know, what have you seen with this, and where do you think this is going? Thank you for joining. God bless, and we'll see you in the next episode.